Professor Fadda Conrey grew up in Beirut, Lebanon, and studied as an undergraduate and again as a master's student at the American University of Beirut. She graduated from Purdue University in 2006 with a PhD in contemporary American literature. She has since taught at a number of universities, including the University of Sharjah in the UAE, Purdue, and St. Joseph's, and now at Syracuse. She has published a number of articles on gender, race, ethnicity, war trauma, and transnational citizenship in a variety of journals and edited collections, and is currently working on a book manuscript entitled Between the Transnational and the Ethnic, Arab-American Literary Renegotiations of Self and Home. Please join me in welcoming Professor Fadda Conrey.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. My talk is actually a truncated version of the part of the bigger project that I'm working on, and I'd be more than happy to elaborate on some of the points that I raised today. In Orientalism, Edward Said posits imperialist projects' crucial formation of what he calls imaginative geographies of the East and the role they played and continue to be playing in the current geopolitical moment in constructing and consolidating the other, stating that, quote, "There's no doubt that imaginative geography and history help the mind to intensify its own sense of itself by dramatizing the distance and difference between what is close to it and what is far away," unquote. The revision of such imperialist and hegemonic constructions of place and space necessitates what Said also calls a critical and discursive rethinking of geography in order to reconceive the struggle over it. Looking at contemporary Arab American novels like Randa Jarrar's A Map of Home, which was published in 2008, and Layla Halabi's West of the Jordan, published in 2003, I examined the way in which Arab American cultural production challenges and revises the formula of difference in or as distance embedded in the Orientalist discourse, thus delineating a revisionary cartographic discourse that reworks the limited and binary divisions that separate the Arab world from the West. In doing so, these narratives enact the important discursive task described by Derek Gregory in his book, The Colonial Present, where he says, "For us to cease turning on the treadmill of the colonial present, it will be necessary to explore other spatializations and other topologies, and to turn our imaginative geographies into geographical imaginations that can enlarge and enhance our sense of the world." By positioning Arab American identities within and across multiple sites of belonging, both in the US and the Arab world, the fictional texts I'm concerned with here contribute to such geographical imaginations by creating a specific transnational cartography of spatial movement that cuts across particular localities. Drawing on the works of cultural theorists like Khatchik Tololian, for one, I argue that the concept of translocality exhibited in various Arab American literary texts alters our understanding of national, transnational, diasporic, and ethnic belongings. As Tololian points out in his important essay, The Contemporary Discourse of Diaspora Studies, privileging a logic of mobility should not disregard the fact that contemporary transnational diasporas require settled diasporic nodes in which a public sphere and civil society peculiar to them develop. Some of the privilege that the new logic of spatialization and mobility has taken away must be restored to locality and place. Moving across and between locales as various as Kuwait, Egypt, California, Arizona, the West Bank, and Jordan, these narratives by Halabi and Jarrar simultaneously evoke complex mappings of diasporic connections to the Arab world, specifically here Palestine, as well as multi-layered forms of Arab American belonging in the US. It goes without saying that not all experiences and rememberings of the homeland are similar or are processed through similar narrative positionings. But what is common among such remembrances is the way they give the shape to the discursive layers of a complex Arab-American diasporic space that challenges the assimilation model of U.S. belonging, and at the same time questions hegemonic narratives about wars and conflicts in the Arab world. These spaces then, as remembered and reconstructed in the narratives handled here, come to echo and even bleed into each other, evoking a contrapuntal reading of the writers' and characters' experiences of these locales. The contrapuntal analysis of transnational localities produces a specific consciousness of space and temporality that contributes to what Ella Shohat, for one, describes as critical maps of knowledge, fundamental in transnational age, typified by the global travel of images, sounds, goods, and populations. In fact, the focus on depicting transnational, okay, I'm going to skip this part, sorry, I'll just go to the novels. Published in 2003, as I mentioned, Layla Halabi's first novel, West of the Jordan, encompasses a variety of stories and viewpoints that cut across and question spatial and temporal binary representations, separating the past from the present, home from diaspora. At the heart of this multi-local perspective, exhibited by many of the characters in West of the Jordan, lies the imagined as well as the real place of Palestine. For those of you not familiar with the storyline, West of the Jordan consists of a series of short chapters written from the rotating perspective of four cousins, again the theme of cousins, Hala, Khadija, Suraya, and Mawal. The book's narrative viewpoints straddle multiple locales, with Mawal describing her life in the small Palestinian village of Nawara on the West Bank, Khadija and Suraya negotiating Arab ethnic identity and their parents' immigrant life in California, and Hala adjusting to a life in Jordan on her short visit while she actually lives in Arizona with her uncle, but she's back for a short visit in Jordan. The stories of these four cousins crisscross and overlap, holding at their center the locality of Palestine, both as imagined in its pre-1948, pre-dispossession dimensions, and as concretely represented by post-1967 the village of Nawara. Crucial to the novel's cartographic layout of translocal mobility is not only its emphasis on the characters' disconnection from Palestine, but the way they transform this disconnection or deterritorialization into a form of reterritorialization. Hala is one of the main characters who carries out the revision and reterritorialization of a bounded and fixed version of Palestine. Her transnational mobility allows her to replace a fixed map of home with a more malleable and borderless one that incorporates the Jordan of her father that she grew up in and the village of Nawara that her mother was exiled in marriage from, as well as the diasporic space of the U.S. The open-ended version of homeland generated by this malleable and multi-local perspective comes in direct contrast with the concept of an unchanged and unattainable Palestine, as imagined by the novel's older generation of Palestinian exiles, even those living in Arab countries such as Jordan. Such a fixed view is represented by the character of Sharif, Hala's older cousin on her mother's side, who lives in Amman and also hails from the village of Nawara. During her visit to Jordan, Hala reacquaints herself with Sharif and falls in love with him, but ultimately her return to the U.S. and to her studies trumps any chance of marrying him and staying in Jordan. In an interesting passage, Hala recounts her memory of an afternoon from her childhood, when she was 5 or 6, spent on the Aqaba beach with her family. Sharif, 19 or 20 at that time, looks across the water to what he describes as home, to Palestine, convincing the young Hala that they can paddle across the border that he sees as starting somewhere in the middle of the body of water between Aqaba and, in his mind, Palestine. While listening to Sharif, Hala sees a small shell under the water, but when she goes to grab it, the water moves it and it vanishes. This shell, like Palestine itself, or at least the version that Sharif had created in his mind, remains physically inaccessible. The more intently Sharif talks about reaching home, or Palestine, across the water, the more blurry the water becomes until Hala cannot see the shell anymore. Knowing full well that the Israeli soldiers will not let them cross into Israel, Sharif reluctantly abandons his plan of returning to his homeland of his imagination and is led back to the Aqaba shore by the Jordanian Coast Guard. Sharif's dogged belief in his clearly bounded pre-1948 traceable contours of his imagined version of Palestine re-emerges decades later when he places in Hala's hand an envelope with a gold charm of Palestine in it. On the plane back to the US, she puts the charm on her necklace and runs her fingers along its edges, thinking of Sharif and his wedding plans. Hala, however, has her own version of a portable, in quite the literal sense, symbol of Palestine, naming her mother's rosa, or Palestinian dress, made by her grandmother for her daughter's trousseau. Even though her father deems it inappropriate, she insists on wearing it on the flight back to the US. In her appropriation of her mother's rosa, Hala is not merely replicating someone else's version of Palestine identity, but refashioning it in new ways to suit her. Not only does she choose not to wear the usual t-shirt and shalwar pants that her mother would typically wear under the rosa, but she also relinquishes the belt around her waist, thus creating a more fluid, free-flowing, and amorphous version of the rosa and its representation of Palestine and of Palestinian identity that Sharif hands her with its clearly demarcated borders. It is my contention here that it is Hala's physical enactment of a translocal traveling identity that helps her achieve a constant reconceptualization or reterritorialization of Palestinian and, by extension, Arab subjectivity in the US diaspora. That is, traveling between and across multi-locales of Palestinian diaspora, including Amman, Arizona, and California, and being exposed to multiple and often contradictory versions of an imagined and actual Palestine, allows Hala to integrate a constantly changing conception of the homeland. Back in Arizona, Hala feels alone with the white walls that never bothered me before, and so much longing for a home that doesn't exist anymore. And she says, I close my eyes again and go back just like that, 8,000 miles in the blink of an eye. But daydreaming and memories alone are no nourishment for Hala's starved appetite for home. Instead, she dresses the empty walls with pictures of the places and people that denote home for her, in this way rendering the absent past a concrete and spatialized present. In this way, the incorporation of a multi-local sense of home place within the spatial diasporic US domain informs the complexity of Arab American subject formations that challenges the difference in distance formula by importing intimate and collective notions of other homelands into the US landscape. But these collections, I insist, are anti-nostalgic. Rather than forgetting or latching onto a temporally fixed memory of the homeland, Hala insists on a type of reterritorialization that prioritizes remembering as well as reinventing this homeland. And I really like this notion of reinventing. And I'm also borrowing from Edward Said with this notion of reinvention because it comes from the Latin word to find again. And it was used in classic rhetoric to describe a process by which you find past experiences and rearrange them to give them eloquence and novelty. It's not creating from nothing, it's reordering. The reconceptualization of imaginative geographies of home and homeland through translocal mobility is also carried out by the main character Nidali in Jarrar's coming-of-age novel, A Map of Home. Nidali's background in and of itself is made up of a dizzying mix of Arab and US affiliations. Born in Boston to an exiled Palestinian father and an Egyptian Greek mother, Nidali moves with her parents at a very young age to Kuwait, from which they subsequently flee during the Gulf War, heading first to Alexandria and then to Texas. With her family status shifting from expatriates in Kuwait to refugees in Egypt and finally to immigrants in the US, Nidali starts out with very limited geopolitical knowledge of her complex and intersecting backgrounds. With a large part of the novel focusing on Nidali's childhood in the Arab world, the narrative exemplifies the way in which translocal mobility can shape the reimagining or reinvention of an original homeland from within a trans-Arab national sphere. Alongside the permeating presence of other Arab locales and affiliations, Palestine retains a central position in the development of Nidali's political and national consciousness. Initially, Palestine is for Nidali, to the most part, a blurry and mythical entity, with her immediate first-hand memory of it restricted to the humiliating treatment she and her family receive when crossing the Allenby Bridge, when traveling to Jenin. But slowly, over the course of the novel, Nidali comes to articulate an understanding of place and belonging that encompasses a transnational and translocal struggle over geography. The struggle is primarily focused on the inescapable Palestinian-Israeli conflict, as well as the different perspectives on the homeland prevalent among various Palestinian and Arab generations. In Nidali's case, this struggle over geography leads to a rethinking of geography. So, because toward the beginning of the novel, responding to her father, who's a self-described failed poet, and his diatribe about growing up writing about our homeland, about Palestine, and how he grew tired of writing about war and how sad we were after 67, Nidali reveals her disconnection from and ignorance of Palestinian and Arab history by asking, "What is 67? After a vitriolic rant bemoaning his daughter's colonialist education, Baba, her father, promptly gives her a detailed history lesson and leads her to the page in a blue book titled "Palestine is My Country," all caps, with the real Palestine on it, with the real map of Palestine on it, and made her trace the map and draw it over and over again. But Nidali quickly realizes that cartographic representations, specifically here in the case of Palestine, are not what they seem to be. For in actuality, they often involve great levels of geopolitical restrictions and maneuverings. On a plane from Egypt to Jordan, where they could cross the Allenby Bridge into the West Bank, Nidali finds a map clearly showing Palestine as the country stuck to Egypt, prompting her to ask her father, "Why can't we just drive there," meaning Palestine, "or take a plane straight there?" The discrepancies between topographic mappings and political actualities push Nidali to confront the arbitrary factors involved in the movement of bodies across boundaries, depending on the national, religious, political, and ancestral makeup of these traveling identities. Adhering to such fragmented deployments of Palestinian and, by extension, Arab cartographic representations, Nidali internalizes the advice her grandfather gives her when reminiscing on his involvement in World War II and the Free Officers' Revolution in Egypt. And he states, "Political power is the knowledge and command of space. You should learn that when it comes to maps, accuracy is always a question of where you stand." Such advice is further consolidated by her father, who, upon seeing Nidali reproduce the real map of Palestine that he had initially taught her how to draw, admits to the instability of this type of cartographic representation. And he tells her, "That map is from a certain year. The maps that come earlier look different, and the ones that come after even more different. There's no telling where home starts and where it ends." Upon hearing this pronouncement, we see Nidali actively rethinking geography by revising this perfect map of home that she had started out with. In doing so, she not only acknowledges but privileges her subjective position within and on this map. And I'm just going to quote a passage where she's revisiting this notion of maps from her vantage point of her room in Alexandria. "I took the map of Palestine. I drew to my room, flipped my pencil, and brought the eraser tip to the page. I erased the western border, the northern border. I erased the southern and eastern border. I surveyed what remained, a blank page, save for Galilee. I stared at the whiteness of the page blended with the whiteness of my sheets. You are here, I thought, as I looked at the page and all around me, and oddly, I felt free. And I've got a lot to say about this passage, but I won't go into too much detail here. But with the revised borderless map of home, representing an over there, blending into the physicality of Nidali's temporary bedroom in Alexandria, where her family fled to during the First Gulf War, Nidali maps out a revised cartography of identity that Gregory referred to. By reshaping fixed mappings of home, whether it be Palestine or otherwise, Nidali is in fact reshaping predetermined definitions of her own identity, thus breaking constructed, artificial, or unilocal understandings of home, redefining belongingness in the process. This type of belongingness retains displacement at its central locus, with the locality of this displacement switching from an Arab to a U.S. Context when they moved to Texas at the end of the novel. In this way, both Hala's and Nidali's contrapuntal perspective redraws imagined as well as actual cartographies of struggle and identity by collapsing, by way of travel and mobility, what is conceived as the distance and its concomitant difference separating various spheres and locales of knowledge and identity. Their acts of re-territorialization becomes important in producing alternative, anti-Orientalist, imaginative geographies of the Arab world, ones that revise binary mappings of home to produce a more open-ended and fluid cartography that stresses physical and metaphorical mobility, thus changing the understanding of and relationship between geography, knowledge, and power. Thank you.